Have you ever laughed at something you didn't find funny just because everyone else was laughing? Agreed with an idea that made your stomach turn because silence felt more dangerous? Clapped for someone you secretly despise? Smiled when you wanted to scream? You didn't do it because you're weak. You did it because something deeper than reason whispered. Now is not the time to stand out. Now is not the time to be real. Now is the time to dissolve. And so you dissolved, not through conscious choice, but through cellular compliance. Your nervous system read the room before your mind could object. Your micro-expressions bent to match the collective mood. Your authentic reactions were suffocated before they could surface. You didn't notice this happening, but your body registered every signal. The slight tension when someone spoke out of turn, the collective exhale when conformity was restored, the invisible current that flows through every group demanding sameness. You became digestible, inoffensive, a perfectly calibrated social echo. This programming didn't begin yesterday. From childhood, you've been conditioned to sense the boundaries of acceptable expression, to scan every room for the unspoken rules, to never disturb the social equilibrium, to never become the person who makes others uncomfortable with reality. Jung understood this mechanism. The way human consciousness can be molded through nothing more than subtle social pressure, repeated until it becomes indistinguishable from your own preferences. Now you inhabit a world where you perform a character whose lines were written by committee, where your responses are pre-approved, where your laughter serves social lubrication rather than genuine amusement. And somewhere beneath this performance, behind the manufactured agreeability, behind the careful modulation of your presence, your actual self has been slowly starving. This isn't social dysfunction, it's sophisticated behavioral conditioning that operates below conscious awareness. Your mind has been colonized by external expectations so thoroughly that you've forgotten where the group's preferences end and yours begin, the most insidious part. This colonization requires no visible restraints, no authoritarian force, no explicit command, just the gentle, constant pressure of belonging, applied until resistance dissolves into reflexive compliance. Because what you're experiencing isn't personal weakness, it's the predictable result of living within systems designed to harvest your compliance while maintaining the illusion that your submission is voluntary. These systems don't need to break you, and they can simply redirect your natural desire for connection into channels that serve institutional rather than individual needs. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. Gustave Le Bon witnessed it decades before digital algorithms amplified the effect. The precise moment your individual consciousness gets absorbed into something larger and infinitely more primitive. It doesn't matter how educated you are, how analytically sharp, how fiercely independent you believe yourself to be. The moment you enter a crowd, your cognitive sovereignty begins to hemorrhage. Your mind stops generating original thoughts and starts absorbing collective frequencies. Your carefully constructed judgments bend toward the group average like iron filings responding to a magnetic field. Because crowds operate on a different level of consciousness entirely. They possess their own crude intelligence, their own emotional momentum, their own gravitational pull that draws your nervous system into synchronization with something that processes information faster than you, but with infinitely less precision. Your psychological boundaries become permeable. The mental firewall that normally protects your individual analysis from external interference starts developing security breaches. Your personal will transforms into something fluid, moldable, responsive to currents you can't even detect. Suddenly, you're cheering for outcomes you'd privately oppose, agreeing with statements that would normally trigger your skepticism, feeling emboldened. But it's not your courage. It's borrowed energy from a collective that mistakes volume for validity. This is how rational people become participants in madness, how moral individuals contribute to collective cruelty, how your personal integrity gets rewritten, not through force, but through the gentle undertow of group consciousness pulling you away from your own center. Le Bon understood that this phenomenon doesn't require massive gatherings. A comment thread can trigger it. A dinner party where everyone shares the same opinion. A workplace meeting where dissent feels like career suicide. The mechanism remains identical. Your individual nervous system detecting that independent thought carries social risk, then automatically downgrading your cognitive autonomy to maintain group membership. This isn't a character flaw. It's an evolutionary adaptation that helped human tribes survive by ensuring rapid consensus during emergencies. But in modern environments, this same mechanism gets exploited by systems that benefit from reduced individual thinking. You become a transmission point rather than a thinking being. Your responses echo the room's mood rather than reflect your actual analysis of available information. The more frequently you inhabit these spaces, the more your capacity for solitary reflection atrophies. Your mind becomes dependent on external validation to confirm its own conclusions. This erosion serves institutional purposes perfectly. Crowds are predictable. Crowds are manageable. Crowds generate profitable behaviors without requiring individual persuasion. But crowds also generate something else. The illusion that your dissolved individual judgment represents sophisticated social awareness rather than psychological submission. You think you're the only one who disagrees, so you stay quiet. But here's what's actually happening. Everyone else in that room is experiencing the exact same internal resistance, the same quiet revulsion, the same urge to object. Yet each person assumes they're the sole dissenter. Each believes they're the only one whose mind is rejecting what's being presented as obvious truth. This isn't social awkwardness or excessive politeness. This is pluralistic ignorance, a psychological trap where the majority privately rejects what they publicly appear to endorse, creating a collective delusion that sustains itself through individual silence. Elizabeth Noel Neumann identified this pattern decades before digital platforms weaponized its deployment. She understood how shared delusion could masquerade as social consensus through what she termed the spiral of silence, the process by which dissenting voices eliminate themselves from public discourse. When people fear social exile more than they value accuracy, something catastrophic happens to their relationship with reality. They don't just suppress their objections, they begin questioning their own cognitive apparatus. They convince themselves that their discomfort indicates personal error, that if no one else is protesting, perhaps their protest impulse is pathological. That resistance itself might be the malfunction requiring correction. This cognitive recalibration serves a protective function. It's psychologically easier to assume you're wrong than to assume everyone else is participating in collective self-deception. The spiral accelerates through recursive silencing. Disagreement transforms into deviance. Questioning becomes antisocial behavior. Even mild curiosity starts feeling like aggression against group cohesion. This mechanism allows toxic ideas to flourish without requiring enforcement apparatus. Lies sustain themselves through voluntary silence. Systems maintain control not through oppression, but through exploiting each individual's fear of being the first person to acknowledge that the emperor has no clothes. You witness this dynamic everywhere. Classrooms where students suspect the professor is wrong but no one raises their hand. Corporate meetings where everyone nods at demonstrably flawed strategies. Online spaces where skeptical thoughts get deleted before they're posted, not because the presented ideas possess merit, but because challenging them requires someone to sacrifice their social safety first. Noel Neumann recognized that in these environments, truth becomes secondary to belonging. Reality gets subordinated to the maintenance of group harmony. But she also understood something crucial. This entire structure depends on each individual believing they're alone in their resistance. The moment people realize their private doubts are widely shared, the spiral can reverse itself with devastating speed. One voice willing to breach the silence can shatter the illusion of consensus that keeps everyone trapped in collaborative self-censorship. No commands were issued, no explicit threats materialized, no authority figure demanded your compliance. Yet you conformed anyway. Solomon Asch demonstrated this with laboratory precision. Place an individual among confederates who unanimously provide obviously incorrect answers, and the majority will abandon their own perceptual evidence to match the group's fabricated consensus. This isn't fear of physical consequences. This is something more primitive, the terror of social excommunication, of becoming the anomaly that shatters the group's comfortable illusion of unanimity. Your nervous system reads these dynamics faster than your conscious mind can process them. It detects the microsecond shifts in facial expressions when someone deviates from accepted position. It registers the subtle changes in vocal tone that follow unwelcome observations. It anticipates social penalties before they're consciously administered. Nietzsche identified this psychological enslavement centuries before Asch quantified it. He understood that most human behavior stems not from conviction, but from the desperate need to remain camouflaged within the collective, to avoid the existential terror of standing alone against group judgment. You don't endorse ideas because they align with your analysis. You endorse them because everyone else appears to endorse them, and dissent feels like volunteering for psychological exile. The moment you breach this unspoken contract, atmospheric pressure in the room shifts. Conversations develop subtle edges. Eye contact patterns reorganize. The social temperature drops by precisely the number of degrees required to communicate disapproval without explicit confrontation. You've committed the ultimate transgression, refusing to participate in the collective maintenance of a shared fiction that everyone knows is fiction but no one acknowledges as such. This refusal threatens the entire system because these social fictions aren't sustained by their logical validity. They're sustained by unanimous performance, by the appearance of universal acceptance that makes questioning feel like madness. The corrective pressure never announces itself or justifies its demand. It operates through ambient social cues, the pause that follows your comment, the glance exchanged between others, the slight energy shift that follows any deviation from approved narratives. Your compliance behaviors activate automatically to restore equilibrium. You find yourself laughing at statements that internally appall you, nodding at conclusions that contradict your direct experience, applauding performances you privately find disturbing. This isn't cowardice. It's your brain treating social isolation as an existential threat requiring immediate behavioral recalibration. Asch understood that this mechanism operates below conscious awareness, generating compliance through anticipatory anxiety rather than actual punishment. The system doesn't need to discipline dissent because you discipline yourself through the mere possibility of social consequences that may never materialize. If you're feeling exhausted, fragmented, perpetually misaligned with your surroundings, this doesn't indicate psychological malfunction. This indicates that some essential part of your consciousness has refused to be fully anesthetized by the social sedatives that keep others comfortably numb. Jung recognized this particular form of existential distress. He understood that the individuals who experience the deepest discomfort in conformist environments are often those whose psychic integrity remains most intact. What you're experiencing isn't pathology. It's your nervous system finally registering the enormous energetic cost of maintaining a false identity constructed solely to ensure social survival. For years, you've been unconsciously monitoring every environment for acceptable parameters of expression, scanning conversations for safe topics, calibrating your responses to match group expectations, suppressing reactions that might disturb collective comfort. This adaptive camouflage served its evolutionary purpose. It kept you employed, included, romantically viable. But it also created a profound schism between your public performance and your private experience, between the character you play and the consciousness trapped beneath it. Now your psyche is refusing to sustain this energetic hemorrhage, not through dramatic rebellion or explosive confrontation, but through symptoms that communicate what words cannot. Chronic fatigue from constant self-surveillance, anxiety from perpetual response, filtering, depression from inhabiting a borrowed personality. These aren't disorders requiring pharmaceutical intervention. These are communications from your deeper intelligence, signals that the current operational system has become unsustainable. Jung called this process individuation, the gradual integration of split-off parts of the personality that have been banished to maintain social acceptability. It's not about choosing between authenticity and belonging, but about developing the capacity to remain genuinely present without automatically defaulting to performance protocols. This integration feels like dissolution because it requires dismantling the elaborate false self that has been governing your social interactions. Your mind resists this process because the constructed identity, however limiting, provided predictable safety. But what emerges from this controlled psychological demolition isn't chaos, it's coherence. The ability to speak from your actual thoughts rather than from your repertoire of approved responses. The capacity to inhabit your own presence without constantly monitoring external reactions. You stop scanning rooms for emotional cues about how to behave. You stop pre-editing your responses for maximum palatability. You start operating from your own center rather than from borrowed scripts designed to keep others comfortable. This shift doesn't happen through willpower or positive thinking. It happens through sustained attention to the gap between what you actually think and what you find yourself saying. What if the system didn't need to suppress you? What if you began suppressing yourself, automatically, preemptively, with the precision of a well-trained warden monitoring your own thoughts? John Jost mapped this psychological territory with clinical accuracy. He discovered that people don't just tolerate oppressive systems, they actively defend them, rationalize them, even celebrate them, especially when those systems are working against their own interests. Your mind performs this sleight of hand to avoid a more terrifying recognition, that you're trapped within arrangements designed to extract your compliance while offering you the illusion of participation. Because confronting institutional manipulation at its full scale would shatter your basic assumptions about fairness, merit, and social order. It's psychologically cheaper to edit your perception than to restructure your entire worldview. So your consciousness begins generating protective stories that transform systemic dysfunction into natural law. That's just how the world works. It's not perfect, but it beats chaos. At least there's stability. These aren't analytical insights. These are psychic painkillers your mind produces to numb the sting of recognizing your own powerlessness. You find yourself defending hierarchies that exclude you, praising authorities who ignore your existence, endorsing systems that treat your labor as a renewable resource and your attention as a commodity to be harvested. This isn't stupidity. This is your mind protecting itself from the cognitive vertigo that comes with seeing clearly. Because once you recognize how thoroughly you've been incorporated into structures that profit from your compliance, every interaction requires recalibration. Jost understood that this protective mechanism intensifies under pressure. The more unjust a system becomes, the more desperately people's minds work to frame that injustice as inevitable, even beneficial. You see this everywhere. People mocking economic struggle while worshiping wealth that views them as expendable, defending political figures who actively undermine their interests, celebrating institutions that systematically harvest their energy while providing minimal return. They're not consciously collaborating with their own diminishment. They believe they're demonstrating wisdom, realism, mature acceptance of how things actually function. But wisdom would involve recognizing that their acceptance has been manufactured through decades of careful conditioning designed to make resistance feel naive and compliance feel sophisticated. The system doesn't need to convince you it's perfect. It only needs to convince you that questioning it marks you as unrealistic, ungrateful, or dangerously idealistic. Influence isn't mystical, it's mathematical. Bernays discovered something that should terrify anyone who values independent thought. Social pressure operates according to predictable psychological formulas that can be calculated, weaponized, and deployed at scale. The more authoritative the source, the closer their proximity, the greater their apparent numbers. the more your cognitive resistance crumbles, according to measurable patterns that have nothing to do with truth and everything to do with overwhelming your brain's capacity for independent analysis. This isn't about the quality of arguments or the validity of positions. This is about flooding your mental processing system with so much contradictory pressure that surrender becomes energetically cheaper than continued resistance. If one person challenges your perspective, you can maintain your position easily. If 5 people challenge it simultaneously from different angles, doubt begins infiltrating your certainty. If 50 people challenge it, louder, closer, with manufactured consensus, your psychological defenses collapse entirely. Not because they possess superior logic, but because your nervous system treats sustained social opposition as a survival threat requiring immediate behavioral adjustment to avoid potential exile. Latané understood that this mechanism operates below conscious awareness. Your rational mind believes it's evaluating evidence objectively, but your limbic system is actually calculating social risk and automatically adjusting your stated positions to minimize isolation anxiety. This is how digital echo chambers achieve their devastating efficiency. They don't succeed through superior reasoning. They succeed by surrounding you with multiplied voices, amplified through algorithmic proximity, repeated until your capacity for solitary reflection dissolves under constant external input. This is how belief contagion spreads faster than factual verification can follow. How demonstrable falsehoods become accepted reality through repetition rather than evidence. How your information environment gets shaped not by accuracy, but by engagement algorithms that reward emotional intensity over analytical precision. You believe you're researching when you're actually being saturated with pre-selected information designed to guide you toward predetermined conclusions. You believe you're forming independent opinions when you're being herded through carefully orchestrated informational pressure campaigns. Modern platforms exploit these principles with surgical precision. Proximity gets manufactured through personalized feeds that create artificial intimacy with distant voices. Authority gets simulated through verification systems that conflate visibility with credibility. And consensus gets fabricated through algorithmic amplification that makes fringe positions appear mainstream. The system doesn't need to convince you through logical persuasion when it can exhaust your resistance through informational overwhelm. It doesn't need to win arguments when it can make disagreement feel like swimming against an impossible current. This isn't accidental. It's intentional architecture designed to transform independent thinkers into predictable responders who mistake manufactured consensus for organic truth. You never chose the world you inhabit. It was constructed around you, not by dictators wielding obvious force, but by architects of influence who mastered something you were never taught to recognize. Obedience doesn't require coercion when it can be engineered through environmental design that makes submission feel indistinguishable from personal choice. Edward Bernays understood this with prophetic clarity. He recognized that modern control operates not through suppression of options, but through the careful curation of available choices until your selection process becomes a performance of predetermined outcomes. You believe you're deciding, but the menu was composed in your absence. The alternatives were filtered before you arrived at the decision point. The default settings were programmed to guide you toward conclusions that serve institutional rather than individual interests. You click what appears in your feed. You purchase what algorithmic recommendation engines place in your path. You repeat phrases that were focus grouped to feel authentic while serving external agendas. They call this process nudging, a term so gentle it seems benign. But nudging is control rebranded as user experience. It's manipulation disguised as intuitive design that makes your compliance feel like sophisticated consumer behavior. Then comes the architectural genius of false choice presentation. You're never asked whether you consent to the system itself. You're asked to select your preferred method of participation within predetermined parameters. Security or chaos, progress or regression, belonging or isolation. The framing ensures that resistance to the entire framework appears irrational, antisocial, or dangerously naive. Meanwhile, astroturfing floods your information environment with manufactured grassroots movements, synthetic outrage, fabricated consensus that makes institutional positions appear to emerge organically from popular sentiment. You believe you're joining authentic causes, but you're entering carefully scripted narratives written by people who studied your psychological vulnerabilities more thoroughly than you understand your own motivational patterns. Even your rebellion has been anticipated and monetized. Your dissent gets channeled through approved outlets that transform genuine resistance into profitable engagement while neutralizing its transformative potential. Above all, the Overton window contracts imperceptibly. What was once common sense becomes controversial. What was once reasonable becomes radical. What was once true becomes unspeakable. You weren't censored. You were conditioned to self-censor before problematic thoughts could fully form. Your mind learned to edit itself in real time to avoid the discomfort of holding positions that feel socially isolating. This isn't dystopian science fiction. This is market-tested behavioral modification deployed at civilizational scale with surgical precision. They didn't need to colonize your consciousness directly when they could construct the informational terrain your thoughts traverse. They paved your cognitive landscape with curated stimuli, until your most private instincts began echoing public relations campaigns. You're not a puppet dancing to visible strings. You're something more sophisticated, a voluntary participant in your own psychological domestication, mistaking engineered preferences for authentic desires. The system doesn't fear noise. It doesn't fear protests, complaints, or organized resistance movements. It fears the silence that follows when you stop participating in the elaborate performance of collective consent. Not through dramatic rebellion or public confrontation, but through something infinitely more destabilizing: the quiet withdrawal of your automatic compliance. The moment you see through the psychological machinery and refuse to feed it your energy. When you stop laughing at what isn't funny, stop nodding at what contradicts your direct experience, stop applauding what you privately find abhorrent, everything begins to shift. Because this entire system wasn't constructed through domination or explicit coercion. It was built on agreement, on millions of micro-consents, on the accumulated compliance of individuals who believed their individual participation was too insignificant to matter. People who assumed they were powerless spectators in larger forces, not recognizing that their obedience formed the actual architecture that sustains institutional power. When one of those people awakens, when one node in the network of automatic compliance goes dark, the system begins experiencing computational errors it wasn't designed to handle. You become friction in a machine calibrated for smooth operation. You become static in a signal designed for clear transmission. You become an unpredictable variable in equations that depend on behavioral predictability. And unpredictability is what algorithmic systems cannot process or profit from. The system will respond by attempting to pathologize your clarity. It will label you difficult, unreasonable, antisocial. Anything to make your withdrawal from participation feel like personal dysfunction rather than appropriate response to institutional manipulation. It needs your self-doubt more than it needs your rebellion, because doubt makes you question your own perceptions, while rebellion can be co-opted and monetized. But your clarity operates like a contagion that spreads through invisible networks of recognition. You don't need to evangelize or organize. Your mere refusal to participate automatically gives others permission to notice their own discomfort with performing roles they never consciously chose. Your pause before applauding. Your stillness while others nod reflexively. Your silence in moments when everyone else rushes to fill the space with approved responses. These small acts of non-participation fracture the illusion of unanimity that keeps everyone trapped in collaborative self-deception. In that fracture, something ancient and undomesticated begins to resurface. A voice older than social programming, a will that exists prior to the need for external validation. It remembers what authenticity felt like before it became a marketing term, what integrity meant before it required focus group approval, What it was like to inhabit your own presence without constantly monitoring others' reaction. You don't need to demolish existing structures when you can simply stop providing the energy that sustains them. You don't need to fight the current when you can step out of the stream entirely, because once you stop dancing to music you never chose, the choreography begins to falter. And in that silence, that space between the end of automatic compliance and the beginning of conscious choice, real power begins to emerge. Not the kind of power they distribute through institutional channels, but the kind you reclaim by remembering who you were before you learned to be someone else. If this resonates with something inside you, subscribe to the channel. This journey is just beginning.